Good afternoon. Welcome to Conversations at Art Basel, Miami Beach. I'm Ed Winkleman. I am the advisor for the Conversations program. And we're in our third day. A sub-theme that has kind of emerged across some of the conversations we've had so far is the way that social media has provided many artists an agency that wasn't necessarily available to them before. As our panel will discuss today, that comes with a particular caveat. We're very fortunate to have three artists, and guiding them is Tim Schneider, our moderator today, who is the art business editor at Artnet News. And if you will please join me in offering them all a very warm welcome.
Thanks, Ed, and thanks everybody for showing up today. As a reminder, in case you get distracted by Twitter or Instagram during the talk, this will be up on Art Basel's YouTube account in a couple of weeks, at least assuming that I don't say anything today that gets Art Basel's YouTube account banned. So it will be like a real-time experiment here. We'll see how it goes. So just to set things up a little bit, obviously we're all aware that the internet and social media have connected humanity on an unprecedented scale. And just to kind of bring that home a little bit, I want to quote quickly an analyst and NYU professor named Scott Galloway, who wrote in a recent book of his, quote, "As measured by adoption and usage, Facebook is the most successful thing in the history of humankind. There are 7.5 billion people in the world, and 1.2 billion people have a daily relationship with Facebook." End quote. He then goes on to say that 1 of every 6 minutes spent online is spent on Mark Zuckerberg's platform. And just as a reminder, in general, Facebook also now owns Instagram, so keep that in mind as we go through this. Now, as Ed kind of alluded to, there are a whole variety of ways in which social media is providing a tremendous good for artists, not least because they can now share their work easily with millions of people around the world without having to go through traditional art world gatekeepers like curators or dealers or art fair selection committees. But there are also all these ways in which these massive new freedoms come with all kinds of massive new caveats and dangers, and obviously one of those that we're here to talk about today is censorship. And before we go any further into this little labyrinth, I want to now introduce the three brilliant artists that I have on this panel with me today. In the middle, we have Meriem Bennani. Now, Meriem's work, for background, her work combines the conventions of social media, documentary film, reality TV, digital animation, and advertising to explore how media consumption through smartphones and other devices impacts culture. She's also known for applying an absurdist sense of humor to shed new light on taboo subjects, including religion and immigration. To my immediate left, I have Agnieszka Kurant. Agnieszka uses multiple media to discuss how complex social, economic, and cultural systems can operate in ways that blur the boundaries between fiction and reality, nature and culture, and play and exploitation. Her practice includes investigating the so-called invisible economy, in which immaterial or unseen factors influence politics and economics in profound ways. And last but not least, we have the cover boy of today's session, Spencer Tunick. Spencer has been documenting the live nude figure in public using photography and video for nearly 30 years. Since 1994, he has staged over 100 temporary site-related installations of unclothed models, sometimes numbering in the thousands, all to reconfigure our views of nudity and privacy in a non-sexual way. And as you'll hear, his willingness to fight multiple arrests has eventually led to New York State and the U.S. Federal Supreme Court enshrining his rights to freedom of expression in public on First Amendment grounds. So, a lot of ground to cover here. And in our conversations leading up to today, we all have sort of decided that one really important thing is that talking about art and censorship and social media is really an important portal onto much larger issues about technology, about culture, about all kinds of things that affect not just artists, but everybody, including you in the audience and many of the most vulnerable people all around the world. So to start us off on that front, I want to actually start with you, Meriem. And apart from artists, some of the other social media users who have had their accounts censored lately are teenagers who are running meme accounts. And if anybody in the audience is unfamiliar with a meme, first of all, I applaud you for coming here and stretching yourself today with this material. Agnieszka has actually described memes in a really poetic way, which is authorless works. There are these jokes that we don't exactly know where they come from. They just rocket around the internet, and everybody kind of puts their own spin on them, and they propagate, and we're not really sure where they go or how. But Meriem, you've worked with teenagers for some of your most recent works, and so you're really familiar with how they use media and how they think about it and how social media impacts their lives. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what you've seen in terms of how social media, maybe being banned on social media, could affect younger people differently than older people.
Okay, I guess yeah. My last project, I filmed teenagers for 2 weeks, and I did notice their relationship to social media, which is obviously different than mine. But I think that in talking about that, I think what's most important to me is like making distinctions, because I think what happens with them is that because of their age, they don't necessarily make the difference between social media and the internet. Mm-hmm. And like as someone who is pre-social media, like when I was a teenager, I had the internet, but not social media, I think I'm more aware of the difference. And that for me is a really important difference, because social media, like being Instagram or Facebook, they're businesses, you know, and the internet, like a blog is not necessarily a business. And so also, like, the teenagers that I spend time with, they're not necessarily meme artists, or they just like document their life. So there's also a distinction in terms of our talk of like putting your life on social media and your work. And that distinction also has a distinction within it, which is like, and that's something I'd like to talk about, is like, you know, like when you put your work on social media, sometimes that's the work, or it can be an image of the work. And it sounds like a very simple distinction, but I think that for me it's important because, you know, like in terms of censorship, there's a difference between using this actual business to communicate about your work so that people can come and see your actual work in this space that doesn't belong, you know, to the rules of Instagram, where censorship is not an option in that way. And actually having your work being on social media, being that's the work, then to me, like, you're like agree that, you know, like, I guess we tend to forget that it doesn't belong to us. And then those moments of censorship are just reminders that you're actually, like, your platform is this thing that is not, it feels like it's your communities, but it's not, you know. So for the teenagers, I think that's the biggest thing, is that they don't make that difference between just, you know, like that social media doesn't end at Instagram and Facebook, but they're also very vulnerable to it, and I try to have some type of empathy around it, you know. But I think that it's kind of hard to answer your question in a way that, about like their relationship to it, that is not obvious, which is that they put, it's actually emotional. And but I think that's like for most people. Like, I don't think that, you know, like, besides the fact that they don't have a pre-internet life, I think that I probably have a similar relationship to them. I'm just a more like formed human being in a way, so I'm not as vulnerable to Instagram.
Yeah, just to, I think there are a lot of points that you brought up there that I think are really worth digging deeper into. And one of them is this idea of Facebook and Instagram as businesses rather than just as neutral platforms. And Agnieszka, you have done work, a lot of work, and a lot of really great work about exactly this kind of thing. And so I was hoping that maybe you could expand on that idea a little bit, especially in terms of this idea that when a user gets censored online, that actually doesn't prevent the platform they're being censored by from profiting off of them. And I was wondering if you could unpack a little bit more for the audience what exactly that means and what the larger implications are.
So the platforms such as Facebook, Google and Amazon are constantly profiting from our exploitation of our data. The information about us, different kinds of information, is being sold to advertising companies. So each Facebook user constitutes about 1,000 of data points that can be identified based on our gender, sex, preferences, hobbies, size of our apartment, if we have a car, even information about our health insurance, any kind of content that can be gleaned from our interactions with our other people, things we like or things that we post. And so it's been calculated that an average Facebook user, the revenue that Facebook makes from an average Facebook user per year is around $84 in North America, and globally it's somewhere between $20 and $30. So this is how much a single Facebook user brings in terms of revenue to this corporation. So obviously it brings a lot of important questions that are being raised today, like who should own our data, who should be allowed to share this data, who should benefit from this data. Should we actually make any profits ourselves? Or should there be some kind of data trusts that are a kind of publicly owned forms of data ownership? And a lot of my projects have been exploring this invisible, concealed exploitations. So this is one of them. They are kind of portraits of what I see as entire society that became a dispersed factory, because what we're doing is we're just providing our data in a way as if we became a new resource, as if we became a new oil, one could say. So 20th century was about oil as a resource, and now our data becomes this new oil. And any kind of emotions that are expressed on platforms such as Facebook or Instagram, such as anger, fear, hope, enthusiasm, they're all being mined for profit. They are kind of assigned values. There are sentiment analysis algorithms that operate and actually are benefiting from it and are assigning certain advertising and profiling this advertising also based on these exploitations. So I've been trying to kind of portray this kind of what I see as an entire society becoming a gigantic factory. And another important problem that I think the social media is creating for artists in particular and artistic audiences is the question of creation of value in the arts. So in my opinion, this famous statement of Marcel Duchamp, who said that the viewer, the beholder, completes the artwork, today could be in a way modified or updated, and we should perhaps say that the viewer completes the value of the artwork. Because what we're doing as spectators, we're photographing artworks that we see at museums or galleries, and we circulate them on social media, we tag them, we like them, and each of these shares or likes creates perhaps not a single like or share, but in aggregate, it already starts to create significant value. And I think that this is a very fundamental change in how value is produced in culture.
Yeah, again, there's a lot to unpack in all of that. But before we go any deeper into any of those issues, I also want to kind of bring in one more thing. So social media censorship isn't just about kind of emotional effect. It's not even just about profits and the idea that these are companies who are finding ways to monetize what we do all the time. There are also some other, I think, key differences between what social media censorship means for individuals versus what more traditional and older forms of censorship mean. And Spencer, as somebody who has experienced both forms of censorship in your career, I was wondering if you could maybe expound on some of the other ways that maybe people wouldn't necessarily immediately think about social media censorship being, I don't necessarily want to say more insidious, but definitely more complex than what it was like when you got arrested by the NYPD for the first time.
Yes. Well, thank you, Tim. I'm very happy to be here at Art Basel. When I was being pursued by the New York City Police Department under the orders of Rudolph Giuliani to arrest me and the participants, I was actually invited and commissioned by Art Basel to do a work in 1999 in Switzerland. So there's been a long relationship there, and I'm very happy to be here. I think that Instagram, in particular, is the magazine of the world right now. And when the largest magazine in the world is censoring artists, that's a very serious thing. Since 2014, artists working with the body have been contacting me about being kicked off the platform and with no means of appeal. So an artist can work possibly 4 or 5 years developing relationships, collecting people's information, contacts. And so let's say a follower has 100,000 followers or even 10,000 followers. If they post an image repeatedly or even once, their site can be taken down with no recourse. And so it would be as if a Rolodex or your address book was just thrown into the ocean. So artists were just completely frustrated, contacting me with anger that was so, so deep that I realized how much of a problem it was, and it still is a problem.
Now, just to kind of help frame this out even more, I think one of the issues that you nodded to there is this idea that the guidelines that are being used to decide what is allowable content and what needs to be censored, whether that's just taking a post down or going so far as to block a user or delete their account. The rules on one level seem very simple, and on another, they're actually very complicated and very subjective. So I just want to take a moment here to read what Instagram's policy on nudity is. It's not going to take as long as you think. Here we go. So we know that there are times when people might want to share nude images that are artistic or creative in nature, but for a variety of reasons, we don't allow nudity on Instagram. This includes photos, videos, and some digitally created content that show sexual intercourse, genitals, and close-ups of fully nude buttocks. It also includes some photos of female nipples, but photos of post-mastectomy scarring and women actively breastfeeding are allowed. Nudity in photos of paintings and sculptures is okay too. Now, on one level, you might hear that and be like, I don't know, that maybe kind of makes some sense. I guess I can see it. But it's one of those things where once you start to really dig into what each one of those terms means, it becomes really problematic really, really quickly. So just to pull out one thing here, those terms create a distinction between nudity in photographic artists' work versus sculptors or painters. And obviously, Spencer, that's been part of your issue, right? If you were just painting images of these kinds of scenes that we've got up on the screen right now, in theory, you would be totally fine. But because you're using a camera, you're not.
Right, there's no distinction. It's not elevating photography or video as an art form. It's sort of diminishing that. And I'm a very tactile person when it comes to my art, obviously. This is real work. And to censor that work to meet Instagram standards would be very difficult. So I've been censoring the genitals in my works for, I would say, since 2014. And first your works get sent to, are picked up by an algorithm, and then it goes to a human person deciding if your site will be, if your image will be taken down, and then depending on that, you get a threat that your site might be taken down if you continue posting. And so the distinction between now the distinction is between what is art and what is pornography, and YouTube allows nudity in art and does not allow pornography. So there is a way for these social media platforms to allow nudity. They just have to spend a little bit more money for human deciders on the back end to sort of, I think right now there's around 15,000 humans working on censorship. Yeah.
Yeah, and one thing that I'll just mention quickly is that we have to, I think it's important to understand what the day-to-day lives of the people who are moderating content online are actually like. There's a writer named Casey Newton who writes for a platform called The Verge, which covers technology, and he's done a lot of investigative reporting about the conditions of content moderators. And just to give you an example, the Facebook formerly used a company called Cognizant to do a lot of their content moderation. Content moderators were being paid there under $29,000 a year. Several of them were coming away with post-traumatic stress disorder. Someone actually died of a heart attack on business. And this is because the life of a content moderator consists of essentially having two screens up in front of you, one that has your platform's community guidelines on it, and one that just has a steady stream of images that have been flagged as offensive or inappropriate in one way. And we're talking about nudity primarily here, but this also applies to violent content. You can just spend your days like watching people be murdered, frankly, and having to decide whether or not that's okay. And obviously that creates a very, very difficult scenario for a lot of people. And so this isn't the Supreme Court that we're dealing with here. These aren't people who have the luxury of very nice lives and lots of time to think about what constitutes art and what doesn't. They're being asked to make very snap decisions under very, very difficult circumstances. That's something I think is important to keep in mind here as we talk about this. Now, stepping away from the human side of things, I want to get back to the algorithms. And Meriem, both you and Agnieszka have done some work with algorithms. You haven't necessarily worked with algorithms. You told me when we were talking beforehand that you spent some time looking at YouTube's algorithms. So can you maybe unpack for people who don't know as much as you do? Like, what is an algorithm and what are the problems with relying on algorithms to try to govern artistic content on these platforms?
Is this working?
Doesn't appear to be.
Okay. Yeah, I kind of like researched the YouTube algorithm, but this was 2 years ago, and I feel like, or like maybe a year ago, and they updated so much that what I was interested in was like a very different question, but just more understanding. It was like about this Moroccan artist who's a dancer, and understanding how YouTube could kind of like understand what type of video like define her type of dancing, and like other people who dance similarly would then like be suggested, but it was kind of like had to do with just the movement. Or it's a different subject. I'm not going to spend time on it, but what I can say is that the way that YouTube functions is that it's really about kind of like mapping out communities around taste and like the type of things you see. And then once once the algorithm understands that you are similar, let's say it decides we're similar users because we watch the same videos, then whatever you watch will be suggested to me. So I was also thinking about the ideas of diaspora, and like I watch a lot of Moroccan music videos, but from America. And but you know what? Like I think we can spend a lot of time explaining algorithms and their biases, but it's kind of like missing the point, because an algorithm is what it is basically is a human saying there are these couple rules, and then you function around these rules, and then there's also now an aspect where the algorithm learns from practice and gets better, and then there's a human that kind of like redirects it and makes sure it goes the direction that we want. So it's kind of like, not to repeat myself, but when I was saying it's a business, it's like the biases of the YouTube of the Instagram algorithm. The problem is just the system that is behind them. They just really reflect other biases, and like these are companies that it's like before even Facebook existed, always profited for the most vulnerable. So the fact that like today people who get censored are like often part of like, there's been statistic studies of like queer and bodies of color are most likely to be shadow banned. Shadow banned is that it's passive aggressive censorship. It's like you're not censored, but your posts are invisible. Somehow no one gets to see them, and then there's censorship. And so, I guess for me it feels absurd when there's a surprise. It's not surprising, and it's kind of like deciding to. When you put your work on the internet, that's why memes are so successful online, is that the very nature of a meme is made for the internet. Like it's made for the platform, that it's born from the platform. So it functions because it's not a precious thing. So when I put artwork on the internet, again, I go back to that thing that I said, is like, I put an image of my artwork, but it's not my artwork. I'm not interested in putting my art on the internet, because once it's on Instagram, it's gonna be flattened out with a meme, a marriage photo, like a selfie, like, it doesn't matter, there's no difference. So I can't expect for it to be treated in a precious way. It feels like, and then also it's like, if I work with Absolute Vodka, like a brand who works with artists, and then they censor me, like, well, I worked with a brand. It's like there are different ways to work with different platforms. So I do feel like, like maybe I have the luxury of having platforms outside of social media to show my work. And before I had access to those platforms, I'd made more work for social media, and I see that shift in my work in that way. But I still think that it's a little hard to be surprised in a way. That we have to kind of work with them, and then they will like censor our work. It's just it doesn't belong to us. It's not on our own terms.
Right. Yeah. It's this tricky thing where we are all opting into the system in one way or another, but then as a result, we're accepting a whole variety of rules and guidelines that we just don't think about until all of a sudden something goes wrong.
And then we haven't read.
Yeah.
They are designed, like they're so long that you can't read them.
Right.
And I was just reading about how the minimum age for Instagram is 13, but then the way that like the guidelines are written, it's like a 13-year-old cannot understand that.
Right.
Right. And probably I can't understand them either. It's like, it's very blurry, and it's made to like make us like forget about the legal aspect of it and think it's just like this like thing that is so fast to open and like use.
Yeah, right. I mean, like, raise your hand in the audience if you have ever actually read the terms of service before you've signed up for something online. Okay, we've got a couple people who are very dedicated, and I appreciate both of you. I personally haven't. I just scroll to the end and I click OK, and I think that's pretty much how it goes. And this brings up an interesting point too, because the guidelines that we're talking about here, they're not even consistent in the sense of unchanging. Like, at least if you're dealing with government censorship, if there's a law that's going to change, it has to go through a process, it gets legislated, we hear about it, and you can kind of prepare for it. But social media platforms are changing their guidelines in real time constantly. You don't necessarily get updates about it. So what might be considered okay one day, all of a sudden will no longer be okay the next day. And it just creates this kind of, very difficult environment to operate in, because if you're not even sure what the rules are, how can you have any idea whether or not you're breaking them at any given point? I want to move back now to the meme thing again, just because I'm a millennial and I can't not just fixate on memes. Agnieszka, you've done a lot of work that really kind of brings out the, mass authorship issue. I was wondering if maybe you could expand on what makes memes special, or what makes them useful for thinking about what social media and tech are doing to us.
So it's one of the most important subjects that I've been trying to explore in my work, and I've been thinking a lot about how authorship is actually something that it's a figure that was only created over the course of evolution of human civilizations as individual authorship. Because originally, early cultural monuments such as mythologies and the Bible, which are undeniably very important cultural products, they were produced collectively, and probably we could today describe them as a kind of groups of memes that circulated within communities and were produced collectively with mostly anonymous authors. And then the figure of the author crystallized, and it didn't crystallize accidentally, and many political scientists and sociologists are pointing out that this figure appeared somehow in parallel to kind of proto-capitalist or early capitalist evolutions of economy, and it was a way of capitalizing on the dispersed labor of an entire society, of the multitude, because obviously one single person, it's easier to identify, easier to fetishize. And I've been really interested in how in contemporary knowledge production, we can actually already observe with Wikipedia, for example, that knowledge is already produced in a different way. It's produced more collectively. So Wikipedia obviously has hierarchies and experts, but definitely it's a collectivity of people that participate in it. And I've been thinking a lot about the fact that the same thing may happen in visual culture, in culture in general, and it's already visible, for example, when you think about that Nobel Prize winners, more and more often, there is more than one person that gets a Nobel Prize, and not only a team of scientists, but also sometimes 2 or 3 people who worked on the same question, the same subject in different parts of the world. So, for example, science is already recognizing this, but in the arts, authorship, singular authorship is doing pretty well still, but I think that it's starting perhaps to erode, or it may erode in a couple of centuries. So a lot of my works have been based on amalgamating, for example, signatures of different people that visited the Guggenheim Museum, like in the image you can see here, users, visitors that are contributing their value to the actual artworks that they see at an institution. But I've also done projects like more recently with creating a sentiment analysis algorithms to produce paintings that are like this one, that are based on converting social energies harvested by our algorithms, our energies of anger, enthusiasm, or fear, how they can actually be monetized and converted into other forms of energy. Because I realized that the global energy market today that provides us with prices and speculates around the prices of oil or gas probably should also include one more energy price, which is the price of social energies, which is they are so easily monetized today because you can sell 100 tweets or 1,000 clicks, and corporations do it, and individuals do it. And so all of a sudden, you can easily potentially convert a certain amount of social energy, of anger or enthusiasm, into another form of energy. And for example, these works are doing precisely that. They are liquid crystal paintings that are perpetually changing and in a way embodying this kind of collectively produced footprints of social energy. So they have multiple authors in many ways. I'm using sentiment analysis algorithms to parse Twitter feeds of protest movements around the world, and then this data is fed into how the patterns on these paintings are changing. So in a way, they present some kind of hybrid authorship situation, and I also am intending to redistribute part of the profits from the sales of these works among the protest movements that I'm harvesting.
Which is a really interesting idea of almost denying the singular authorship precedent that we're used to in the art world, and that kind of shifts us into this position of saying, like, okay, well, what are the potential solutions for moving forward and maybe trying to resolve this issue in some way, shape, or form? And Spencer, have you, in all your experiences of being banned in various forms, like, have you thought of anything that at least maybe has the potential to help artists not have to deal with this just ridiculous regime of shifting principles all the time and like actually have some solidity and be able to know like their work isn't going to be censored?
Well, I think we're so used to people rebelling on social media, and social media is designed to make everyone feel like they're the center of the world. And you're posting, and you have 5,000 followers, and you feel like you're making a large impact, but only a small number of people are actually seeing that post, unless it's of course, a meme that goes viral. But I think these social media companies and media companies are very afraid of actual tactile protests on the streets. And I think an old school protest really gets their attention. So it really goes back to a communal physical activity in cities to, I think, to fight against this machine. And, you know, I don't know why Instagram moved to New York City. I told them that. I thought they should have moved to an industrial park in New Jersey, because there are a lot of artists out there and non-artists that I think might start protesting these companies in a, you know, protests aren't pretty, but I think it's coming unless they change their attitude and their policies on nudity, at least for art. And I think that within 5 or 10 years, 5 or 6 years, there'll be possibly a breakthrough from a distance that the female breast nipple is allowed. But it all starts even from the New York Times and the New Yorker. They don't allow female nipples as well. So it starts from traditional media, from CNN to a lot of the news stations. So it's a whole change has to happen across the board. And again, I think old school tactics of protesting, getting on the streets, is possibly one of the ways it's going to change.
That's an interesting concept because it marries up in a way with what Agnieszka was just saying about collectivism and how, because social media platforms are ultimately, like, their product is us, that means that we have a certain amount of power if we're willing to join together and really come out against something. The issue is that we tend not to think about that, I think. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. I don't spend a lot of time on social media going like, how can I join together with the other users in my feed and activate change in the world? That's just, I'm kind of shallow, ultimately. So, I don't know, Meriem, have you had any thoughts about how to get around some of these issues? Like, do these ideas of collective action ring true to you on any level, or do you have like a completely dystopian vision of where this is going?
Well, it's funny because we talk about it like a country that we can't leave. It's like, if we want to protest it, why keep using it? Like, if I want to protest the government, I have to go in the street and protest because I live here. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
But we're talking about it like we can't leave Instagram, and we just have to like make it better. But it's like when people want to protest Amazon, they just stop ordering on Amazon. But it's like that's what's so I guess that's the violence of it, is that whenever we want to protest Instagram, we forget that that's an option because it's so ingrained in our lives, and we also feel like we need it as visual people. I guess my way of dealing with it is that, you know, I use it, but I also don't count on it in a way for work. It's more, for me, it's like a fun thing. I also, you know, like I don't have work that is ever been censored. Whenever my work has been removed, is because I'm using music that it doesn't belong to me, you know. So it's like, fair enough. So I don't deal with these issues, and in that way, I don't have to kind of like, I don't have any like personal problem with it. But if I was to, I think, have work that doesn't function within it, it wouldn't stop me from doing my work. I would just, I guess, separate things, you know. So I think I'm sure like it would be important to protest it so that they kind of change their guidelines or update them to, you know, politically, but they have to update their politics, and like it's a bigger issue in general.
Yeah, and one thing that I should mention too for background is that a month ago, Facebook and Instagram actually held a summit at their New York offices where they invited a variety of different artists to come in and talk about how they might improve on exactly this issue. And it was a funny thing to read reports of on one level because all of the artists who participated were asked to sign non-disclosure agreements about what happened in the meeting. Some of them talked anyway. And which, more power to artists. God, I love you guys. But the end result of this meeting from people who were there eventually came down to this idea of Facebook making some vague promises about how they were going to update their policies, but there was no real timeline given. There was no real understanding of how they were going to change things. It was just a commitment that we're going to do better. And obviously that doesn't necessarily come as great comfort to people who are really concerned about this issue. I don't think. Agnieszka, one other issue that you brought up recently, or kind of at the beginning, and it looks like this is going to have to be my last question, but you mentioned the idea of data trusts. And I was wondering if you could tell people like what those are and how they're relevant to the types of things that we've been talking here today about in terms of like collective action and ownership and all of that kind of stuff.
So there are currently conversations about this, what seems to be the most important question in contemporary both politics and economy, like who should own our data, or who should be allowed to have access to them, and whether we should be paid for our data when anybody is using them and how. And it's a very difficult problem to solve because obviously, as we know, after the Cambridge Analytica scandal and many other situations, we cannot trust corporations, so these platforms absolutely cannot own this data. Unfortunately, governments also cannot own this data because after what we know how American government, the NSA was spying on American citizens, we know that it's also impossible to 100% trust the governments. And so there are currently ideas of the kind of like a publicly owned data trusts that would have a similar principle of operating to like the blockchain platforms like Ethereum or to some digital cryptocurrencies. But unfortunately, so far all these platforms have also been hacked. So there is not 100% guarantee that these platforms are safe. So yeah, so now there is currently in Silicon Valley a debate to create a form of data trust where their data could be safe. And because just to give you an example of what can happen to our data, there is a company called 23andMe that probably many of you are aware of, that provides the service of like if we send a sample of our DNA, they can look at our ancestry and provide us with some certain information about our potential diseases that we are predisposed for genetically. And of course, this company has a policy that they will not share this data with anyone. But what's going to happen if this company is sold in the future to another bigger company, let's say to Google? The complexities of like what happens with this type of data, and so it goes basically from our physical DNA to our data online. We just can't control it. And a lot of what really surprises me is that a lot of people display a sort of naivete about this because they think that, oh, I'm going to opt out of social media and then it's going to solve a problem. Well, this doesn't solve any problem because today even a loyalty membership card to your local pharmacy or your cash like your credit card that you use in a cash machine, this already leaves digital traces. Basically, one of the things that I'm trying to address in my work is that we constantly leaving these digital traces, even if we're looking for like a birthday present for our boyfriends and we're using Amazon or Google, it's leaving a trace. And this particular preference or emotion that is expressed is being commoditized. But to answer to your question, and kind of a little bit maybe positive, to so kind of look for positives in this kind of very dystopian
Please, God,
situation, it's that, you know, one thing that I realized that, of course, these corporations are constantly aggregating our data and selling them. But how about we also take advantage of these algorithms that are out there and use them to quantify our ability to unionize, to create, to build social movements, and to actually quantify how many are we. Because the most kind of prevailing attitude today in terms of participation and democracy is that most people feel disenfranchised, and they feel that they have no impact on what's happening in politics whatsoever. And it's true when it comes to a singular citizen. But already, you know, when you actually use these algorithms to kind of quantify, it's like me plus my small village or me plus my neighborhood, and you really look at the numbers, then actually you're able to quantify the physical value of our social capital and how it can be invested politically or economically. And you know, it's I will create a kind of an analogy to a protest movement that happened in Poland and in other countries, the Black Protest, which was the movement of women who went out to the streets to protest the ban on abortion, on reproductive rights restraints in Poland. And so the color that the women, but also any supporters of this protest movements adopted was black. And it's only when all these people came out to the streets that you saw how much black there is, that people saw each other, and they could identify the aggregation of this potential social political capital. And algorithms are actually allowing us to quantify it in numbers, and even to express it in terms of financial value. And I think that it's really time to, of course, looking at how much social media did for the Arab Spring, for example, how it was used also in extremely beneficial ways in Taksim Square, and even in Iran, you know, different kinds of alternative social media channels are being used to, in Hong Kong, obviously, to spread revolutionary ideas, pro-democratic ideas, and I think that this is something very important.
So maybe the takeaway here is that whether we are artists or not, if we just allow technology to keep doing its thing, we're probably not going to be super happy about where it ends up. But if we can manage to use it to really work on the ideas of figuring out how many of us have common interests and how we might be able to use that collective power for good, then maybe we can actually really get somewhere with that. We're going to have to leave it there. So I don't do what Mark Zuckerberg did at a speech he gave about free speech in Georgetown, where he then didn't allow the audience to ask questions. I'm going to open it up to you folks out there. So if anybody has anything that they would like to hear. Okay, we have one very enthusiastic person here. Yes.
Is there a social media app like Instagram? Is there a social media app like Instagram that does allow nudity? And if not, why not make one just for artists?
Anybody want to speak to that?
I don't know if there's one, but Pornhub is now starting to work with artists. Oh no, for real. And I think it's gonna really change the way that art circulates. The end. Yeah.
If anybody else wants to add anything else, please.
Well, I
free.
think Twitter allows nudity, and but their interface is not very friendly for the visual artists. So.
Yeah, that may be an understatement. Well, one thing that I'll add here too is that we kind of have, to go back to the idea of social media platforms as businesses, there is actually a case where you can understand from a business standpoint why Facebook and Instagram would take the position that they've taken on nudity, because if anybody remembers Tumblr, which older internet users will know was a blogging site and kind of proto-social media site, Tumblr was a big deal. It got acquired by Yahoo in 2013 for $1.1 billion. And then earlier this year, they were sold to WordPress for under $20 million. And if you're wondering why there was a 98% drop in value that they experienced in about 6 years, you may be able to figure it out based on the fact that apparently the only other interested buyer aside from WordPress was Pornhub. It was a place that a lot of people who were engaged in pro-sex movement, sex positivity, and all kinds of issues in that, or subjects in that realm, really flocked to, and it frankly cratered what advertisers thought they could do with it. So it's a cautionary tale, I suppose. Anybody else?
Yeah. There is actually a social network that was launched, I believe, earlier this year by Maisie Williams. It's called Daisy, and it's directed to artists. So maybe something to explore. And I wanted to say something about, I understand what you were saying, that usually when we want to protest something, we need to stop using it. But actually, Instagram for many artists, such as photographers, which I know many, are a huge deal for them to get more reach and mean a lot for their work. So for them to just stop using it, it hurts them a lot. I know a photographer from Brazil that has taken her account down like 6 times already. And it's a lot of work and context that she loses every time that happens, and it's very frustrating. So I mean, just sharing this out there is just really hard not to be there, but at the same time, it's something that we should fight for. It really makes a difference. So.
Anybody want to comment on that?
No, I mean, I understand what you're saying, and you know, like I'm 31, so like everyone around me uses Instagram. I don't think I would have met that many people without Instagram. So I guess I'm being a little like provocative on purpose, just because I think that there's a frustration around this. You know, that it's like we're participating in it, but we want it to be different, and so I think that it's just kind of like this like thing that is impossible that I'm trying to talk about. You know, that like, yeah, and it's like not possible for everyone to drop it. Again, I use it on a daily basis, but I think that the expectations have to be. We can't be surprised, is what I was saying. You know, and so like, I think that, you know, if everyone kind of like had a different expectation of it, or like if we went to the basis of like what are these systemic problems that the algorithm is reflecting, I think that's like a kind of like more realistic battle. Yeah.
I think it comes from the top. In these offices are all people like us, bright, young people, all nationalities, all genders. And it's just 1 or 2 people making this decision not to free the body on Instagram at various levels. So it's just about 1 or 2 people being a hero, and so we just have to get to those 1 or 2 people. It's not a democracy, the hierarchy of Instagram and Facebook, and so it's just a matter of reaching them at the right moment, and they just say, fuck it, we're going to do it, and we're going to change the world and how people see the body. And so that's what I'm hoping for. And that's why I think making these people uncomfortable as they walk into their headquarters in the major cities with nonviolent, creative, artistic-led protests is possibly a way to do this. Astor Place is it's an open area. And so I invite artists to activate in front of their offices and make works against censorship. And hopefully, if your idea fluctuates through social media, it'll have an impact. But just the physical aspect of getting out and doing something and not being in your bed or on your couch tweeting protests, I think the physical action of protests is still so important in our society, especially against these social media giants.
I do want to add, I don't know the numbers for Instagram, but I think that the tech industry is famously not that so diverse, or you know that, and that might also be one of the problems. You know, like I mean, I'm not saying it based on any specific numbers, but I wonder if like that's also maybe one of the things that can be like the start. You know what I'm trying to say? That before, because the people at the top are responsible of hiring the people who are in the industry, who are responsible of making those algorithms. So it's interconnected in this way. Yeah.
May I ask something? Do you think the nudity trends online would somehow create sort of curatorial renovation online?
Yeah, Tim.
Or do you think it's going to be like an open zoo?
If I'm understanding the question correctly, are you essentially asking whether the restrictions on the use of the body online could actually inspire some kind of creative solutions or curatorially that would maybe push art in a different direction? Is that where we're at? Okay. Anybody like to respond to that concept?
I'm certainly creating works, not specifically for Instagram, but if I will do certain positions, I might include one where I don't have to do much work on Photoshop afterwards, censoring, where I might do a position that alters the bodies as to not reveal genitals, just so I have an ability to post works more freely. And the reason I use Instagram and Facebook is because my medium is people and I gather people. So my relationship to the platform is a little different. So if my site is taken down, my ability to make work is incredibly difficult. But I think it could be changing the way artists create works, at least photographers and video artists working with the body.
Yes.
Thank you guys so much. This was a great panel. My name is London Balbosa, and I'm the founder of ArtHub. That's ARTEHUB. And we are an online e-commerce art discovery platform for aspiring art collectors. My question is for you all. We just received a seed investment by the founders of Home Depot, so we're growing. But my question for you all is, like, what is your perspective on e-commerce and marketplaces, and how do you guys think that will affect or tie into art, social media, and the aggregation of data and content and, the buyer behavior of like how collectors are looking for new mediums to discover art and purchase as opposed to going to galleries and auction houses and so forth?
Well, I guess I can start on that. Not to do a shameless plug. I actually wrote a book about this. So if you can, ironically, you can find it on Amazon. It's called The Great Reframing, and it's all about how technology is impacting the way that the gallery system works, and also how it's not. What I would say in general is that one thing that, in my experience with tech platforms and art platforms, it seems like in most cases those two groups are speaking to largely different languages. You have tech people who don't necessarily understand art all that well, and art people who don't necessarily understand how the tech industry works all that well, and so they can talk past each other in a lot of ways. And I think that's one of the reasons that one of my favorite phrases is the democratization of art. And like anytime you hear that, like personally, my antenna go up, and I'm like, oh no, here we go again. I think it's a really difficult issue. I think that there are a lot of factors that play into it, and the biggest one, which is something that we've sort of talked about up here today, is the age of the people involved, because I think that there is a generation gap that we're experiencing in terms of what people want out of art, even in terms of how they interact with it, how they buy it, how they patronize it in other ways. That is very different for people who are under the age of 40, say, or even younger than that, than more traditional platforms. So it's a tough thing, because on the one hand, I am generally somebody who looks back at history a lot and says, like, well, there hasn't been a lot of progress on this in some senses. On the other hand, it's always dangerous to be like, well, just because this hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it can't happen in the future. Like, that's a good way to just think yourself into a corner.
I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think that there's a very significant change in how the audiences are contributing value to the works, and it's really significant. You know, like I'm sure that your platform is also looking at circulation of images, how many likes or shares a given photograph of a given artwork gets. I know that this definitely impacts, I guess, I don't know, artsy, and many people I talk to that are dealing with online sales of works. There's a direct connection, and so it's based on aggregation of how many people are going to share an image, and it creates a kind of an alternative to institutions, critics, museums that were so far the only the only platforms that were deciding, and here definitely something is changing, and I think it's still kind of unregulated, and it's actually quite interesting how it's going to evolve, and whether there will eventually be some kind of hierarchies, because right now it's just a kind of like uncontrolled, freely evolving. But also I think that it brings up larger questions of this invisible labor of audiences that are now participating and are so now going to a museum where the entrance is free. It's actually not completely free, because you're if only you take out your phone and you leave a trace of you visiting a given exhibition and sharing, you already contributed some value to this work. So it's and of course it brings up questions of how maybe this profits from the works should somehow be redistributed, and among whom and to what degree.
Well said. Yes.
Hi.
Oh wait. Where are we?
Hi, here.
Sorry, I cannot see anybody in the audience for some reason.
Yes.
Terrible. I apologize. Yes.
Sorry. I'm Damian Suarez. Nice to meet you all. Thank you for sharing. I'm artist, Venezuelan living in Mexico. So I've been working a lot in, to build a space in my Instagram where I can share with people what I do, because democracy of art, because finally my collectors, there's like a few people. So there's a lot of young people who is curious about, what we are doing, we all. And yes, okay, in Suarez Studios, my Instagram, I try to build like the idea for people, like receiving something, interesting for them. Then I am part of the screen art. There's a group on Instagram. They just organize around 30 artists from a lot of different places in the world. And I think this kind of things must to happen, more frequently, especially because what happened with young artists, especially in Latin America, is the audience is only is paying attention about superficial stuff. So art is always like at the last, the last thing young people pay attention in. So what I wanna ask you, what do you think about is the challenge, for example, in the new markets when art is not popular, like in Europe or in the States, places like Latin America, where people is not too into maybe contemporary arts. When I say people, is people, common people, in the street, in university. So how's the way you think we artists can be closer to people, trying to share something educative or interesting for people, for young people?
Anyone have any thoughts? I don't know, Meriem, I don't want to put you on the spot, but as somebody who grew up in a very different culture in the US in terms of having grown up in Morocco, I mean, is there anything that you can relate to in that sense of trying to think about this from a slightly different perspective? I don't know, I'm kind of just throwing that out there.
I guess, I often get asked something along those lines.
Yeah, I was kind of afraid that I didn't really want to do it.
But I mean, it's like if there's probably more people in America, statistically, that don't interact with art than like statistically in Morocco. But it's just I get the question, but sometimes I think that the way that I think about it in my work is that I always think I work with real people. I film. Sometimes my family members are different people, sometimes strangers. But it's always been in Morocco, and I always try to think that about them, and like their access to art. So whoever is in my video should be able to have access to my shows is my goal, because it hasn't necessarily happened. Because I mostly have done shows here or in Europe or in places that require visa to go to and all these things. So I always think about that, and it's kind of like something that I feel like is really unresolved, and that I want to, just like be able to get to a place where, like it kind of goes back to we were talking about art market, and as an artist, I'm not the person to talk about the art market, but I still think a lot about how art circulates and how it's around these, big cities, and that's why, Instagram is popular, is that it can circulate in these different ways. But then again, like, as someone who does video installations, it's a physical experience, and my videos are about 30 minutes, and they're never online. So you'll see these little snippets of like a jokey moment, or like, and some people have come to me thinking that's my work, and then they've seen the full film, and they're like, oh, you actually make films, you don't just make memes or like jokes. But my point being, there's like, I think about it a lot, and I think about cinema. And this, I love cinema, and I think that, like the film market has its own problems, obviously. But what I think is interesting is like when a movie comes out, depending on its distribution, it's the problem of access, of course. But the idea is that it comes out in multiple cities, in multiple cinemas at once, and that I make videos, they could potentially come out in a similar way, but then because they exist in the art world, they have to be in this one specific physical space to be seen as installations. So I guess there's something about just kind of like circulation and thinking that like maybe this is a weird idea, but like what if when we did a show for people who have edition work, what if it was in multiple places at once? And then like the conversation would also be more interesting because it would be people from different backgrounds and perspective. So maybe that answers your question. Another potential answer is that it sounds bad, but I make work that's very accessible. And it's like it can be understood like with pleasure. Because it's like something I care about a lot, and humor are things that I think can have like just creating multiple entry points to the work. Don't know if that answers, but
Yes, in the back.
Hi. I know that the three of you are pre-established artists, but what advice would you give to young artists who are underrepresented or without representation, without much exposure on Instagram, how to kind of make it so that they can be discovered or found? And then conversely, what advice would you give to collectors to then find those artists that are underrepresented?
Well, I know that I think the best way is to try to create a friendship, or rather a likeship, with an not maybe an artist, a well-established artist, but other artists who have many followers, and somehow create an online invisible relationship, social media invisible relationship with them. And one day, possibly, they will repost your work or tag you in a post. Because the only way to gain followers, I feel, on social media is not through mass media or art journals or the art world. It's through your contacts on social media. And so I would say to young artists that they have to contact other artists with more followers in order to get their work out there and seen, because in the end you're only around, I would say, what percentage of people actually see your posts? Would it? I know there's not a set number, but would it be 20% or 30%?
Well, I mean, this goes back to the issue of the fact that these platforms are changing their algorithms all the time. I mean, there was famously that episode where after the whole Cambridge Analytica scandal happened on Facebook decided it was going to pivot back to the idea of upping the posts made by your actual friends and family as opposed to advertisers and clickbait and stuff like that. So, and they've pivoted on this a lot, and I think that that's one of the big questions that a lot of people are dealing with, whether they're artists or just individuals or businesses, is, well, how do we even know who's seeing the stuff that we're putting up? And it's just, there's no easy way to answer it other than to say it's probably fewer people than you think. I would say significantly so. And it gets such a top-down process too that I don't really know that there's much that each of us can do to remedy that. Sorry, that's a depressing answer, but...
Well, I think for young artists, connecting to other artists and somehow sharing works in the same way as you would meet someone at a party or go to an opening, that online relationship, that new relationship yet to be formed is a great tool.
Yeah, and maybe this speaks to both the last two questions, which I would say that I would advise people to not take the existing system as a given, whether you're talking about social media or the art market or whatever else. If you just start working within the terms that are already laid out for you, I think that you have very few options. But if you are willing to really work outside of the normal box and say, well, how could this be done very differently than in the past? If I don't need to get a gallery, if I don't need to depend on Instagram to get seen, what else could I do? And it's a big question, but I think it's maybe one that's more fruitful than just saying well, how do I get more people on Instagram to see the posts that I'm making? Anybody else? All right, join me in thanking our panelists first, and thanks to all of you as well.